world this weekend. Good evening, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Tonight, questions swirl around Vladimir Putin's control over Russia a day after an attempted mutiny led by a former ally.
I think this was the biggest mess so far since beginning of Vladimir Putin's rule nearly a quarter of a century ago.
Also tonight, veterans of the Korean War call on Canadians to remember their sacrifices.
We need a legacy, and the legacy is the youth. We need more of the youth out.
And the country's biggest pride celebration hits the streets of Toronto.
Look at the smiling faces. Look at the people that are out just being who they are.
That's later, but first. The whereabouts of Yevgeny Prigozhin are unknown, one day after his failed rebellion in Russia ended abruptly. The leader of the Wagner mercenary group was apparently sent to Belarus in a deal brokered by that country's president. Russian President Vladimir Putin has labeled Prigozhin's actions treason. A lot is still unknown about what transpired and what effect this could have on Putin's grip on power. Briar Stewart reports.
Today, Vladimir Putin was noticeably absent. He didn't make any public addresses, but officials insist he's remained in Moscow working at the Kremlin, even though there were earlier reports of a presidential plane leaving the capital.
That was presented to public yesterday as a compromise. In reality, that was, of course, Putin's defeat.
Mikhail Kasyanov was a former prime minister in Russia between 2000 and 2004 and told CBC News that before this weekend, the elite were already questioning Putin's leadership.
Putin already is seen right now by them as not as a smart leader and successful leader. And moreover, also ordinary people also just facing the same considerations because just they seen what happened in Rostov-on-Don.
As Wagner fighters headed out of Rostov-on-Don Saturday night, it almost looked like a hero send-off as a crowd cheered and took pictures with the fighters. "Thanks a lot," shouted someone from the crowd. "Come back alive," yelled another. Today, the visible signs of the rebellion are gone. Streets are opened, but left behind is a mix of concern and confusion. In a situation where we are in a conflict with another country, how can we have an internal war as well, said one man. Wagner fighters reportedly made it within a few hundred kilometers of the capital when the convoy abruptly stopped, after it was reported that a deal was brokered by Belarus's president Alexander Lukashenko. It ended the rebellion, and Prigozhin was apparently being sent into exile in Belarus. Neither he nor his fighters will face any charges, according to the Kremlin.
I think we can be confident in saying this is the beginning of a new phase. Is it the beginning of the end of Putinism? That I'm not sure of.
Jade McGlynn is a research fellow in the War Studies Department at King's College London.
Really, a lot will depend on his next few actions, and in particular on what happens in Ukraine, because if he were able to secure some successes, or at least something that he could spin as a success, that would help to bolster him.
Putin called the revolt a mortal threat to Russia's statehood. The country's propaganda channels are painting it as if Putin's quick decision-making saved the day. But this was the biggest challenge he's faced yet in his more than 2 decades in power. Briar Stewart, CBC News, London.
While yesterday's insurrection did not topple the Russian regime, the consensus from many Russia experts is it did show there are cracks in Vladimir Putin's armor, and his adversaries are watching closely. Katie Simpson now on the reaction from outside of Russia and what this all means for Ukraine.
I think we're in the midst of a moving picture. We haven't seen the last act.
The West is gathering as much intelligence as it can, watching and waiting to better understand what just happened. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the direct challenge to Russian President Vladimir Putin would have been unimaginable just months ago.
What we've seen is extraordinary, and I think you've seen cracks emerge that weren't there before.
One of the most significant cracks, according to Blinken, is the message Yevgeny Prigozhin delivered to the Russian people in videos where he criticized the war effort, declaring that Putin's premise for invading Ukraine is a lie. Blinken says all of this serves as a helpful distraction at a time when the Ukrainian military grinds on through its long-planned counteroffensive.
I think that creates even greater openings for the Ukrainians to do well on the ground.
Over the past 48 hours, the crisis triggered a series of high-level calls and meetings among NATO leaders. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was also brought into some of those discussions, where he again pressed allies, including Canada and the U.S., for additional military support.
We can't scream loudly enough in terms of how important it is for speed right now, for NATO, for Western allies, to give Ukraine what it needs.
Michael Bosserque is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. His worry now is that Putin may feel cornered or embarrassed and behave even more erratically.
Mr. Putin may want to show some of his own strength in the only way he knows how, by firing more missiles at Ukraine.
This is a widespread concern, especially since Russia has a large nuclear arsenal. The U.S. says so far the instability has not changed Russia's nuclear posture. This moment has largely been interpreted as a failure for Putin. Vladimir Milov, a former Russian deputy minister of energy, questions whether this will bring about change in Moscow.
I think this was the biggest mess so far since beginning of Vladimir Putin's rule nearly a quarter of a century ago.
There has been some public support for Putin, predictably coming from Russia's most important ally. In a series of statements, Chinese officials described the uprising as an internal affair, praising stability and the leadership of the Russian Federation. It remains unclear how much stability there truly is inside the Kremlin, and whether this is the end of something significant or just the start. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
As Katie mentioned, there was a flurry of phone calls today about what's happening in Russia. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke with the presidents of both Ukraine and the U.S. about it. He'll also talk with several leaders of Nordic nations as part of a summit on a small island off Iceland. That's where Trudeau is tonight, along with the CBC's Tom Perry.
Under grey skies, through steady rain, a ferry carried Justin Trudeau and his fellow leaders to the island of Vestmannaeyjar off the south coast of Iceland. This island, the site of a historic volcanic eruption half a century ago, is where the prime ministers of Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Norway and Denmark are meeting, with Canada as an invited guest.
And I'm so happy, and I think all the Nordic prime ministers, we are happy that you have possibility to visit here.
Trudeau met one-on-one with Finland's newly elected Prime Minister Petteri Orpo on the ferry ride to the island. The two talked just briefly about issues like Russia's war in Ukraine and the internal tensions within Russia that have exploded into view in recent days.
I just, over the past hour, have spoken with President Zelensky and President Biden, so we'll be talking about that as well. But lots of things for us to discuss as friends and partners in a very complicated world where
Canadian officials see this meeting as a lead-up to next month's NATO summit in Lithuania. Finland recently became NATO's newest member. Sweden, also at this summit, is seeking to join as well, but is facing opposition from Turkey, another alliance member.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The host of this meeting, Iceland's Prime Minister Katrin Jakobsdottir, says Nordic leaders need to address issues like climate change and Arctic security. But speaking today on the CBC's Rosemary Barton Live, she acknowledged that at this summit, the situation in Ukraine and now inside Russia will command attention.
We followed, of course, the situation very closely. We are going to use some time in our meeting to talk about that. Yeah. But I think it shows, obviously, that there is growing internal conflict in Russia.
Russia's growing aggression recently prompted Iceland to close its embassy in Moscow and instruct the Russian government to sharply reduce the number of diplomats it has deployed to Iceland, another sign of the growing discord between Nordic nations and their erratic and unpredictable Russian neighbor. At this summit, Canada will look at how it can support these countries and what lessons it might learn from them. A brief summit with a lengthy agenda. Tom Perry, CBC News, Vestmannaeyjar, Iceland.
The U.S. Coast Guard is investigating what caused the Titan submersible to implode, killing all 5 people on board. The undersea vessel went missing last Sunday on a voyage to the wreckage of the Titanic, setting off a days-long search and rescue mission. The Coast Guard has opened what it calls a Marine Board investigation. Here's Chief Investigator Captain Jason Neubauer.
The board will first and primarily work to determine the cause of this marine casualty and the 5 associated deaths. The MBI, however, is also responsible for accountability aspects of the incident, and it can make recommendations to the proper authorities to pursue civil or criminal sanctions as necessary.
Neubauer says they have mapped the debris site and salvage operations are ongoing 4 kilometers below the surface. A funeral is being held today for the president of a Sikh temple in Surrey, BC, who was gunned down more than a week ago. Hardeep Singh Niger was shot to death in his vehicle on June 18th in the parking lot of his temple. He was a prominent and controversial community leader who had advocated for an independent state for India's Sikh minority. Niger was well known in India, where he had angered the authorities there. Some of his supporters here have held protests, claiming his death was the result of foreign interference. The CBC's Susanna De Silva is on the story for us today, and we spoke to her earlier. Susanna, what's the scene been like there today?
Well, mourners were lined up out the blue gates and onto the sidewalk at several points today as thousands came to pay their respects to the temple president. You might be able to hear a buzzing in the air, and that's a small plane that has been flying overhead in circles above the Gurdwara with a banner behind it in his support. Many here waiting in line to pass by his casket with dozens of yellow Khalistan flags flying, and prayers on the loudspeaker continued outside and inside, including one of them calling him a servant who has served to the maximum of his duty. 45-year-old Niger was gunned down last Sunday outside this temple, leaving evening prayers, and those who came today say they did so out of respect for what he did for this Gurdwara and for Sikhs who believe in a separate state. They also want answers about who killed him.
The community, he helped a lot during COVID times. Everybody he left helped him a lot, and he was really snatched away from us.
My wish is that it shouldn't happen in such a beautiful country we live in. But it has happened. We need to pause and reflect.
And officials with the temple say there will be an unprecedented procession through the streets with his casket from the temple to the funeral home.
And Susanna, his supporters are making allegations about foreign interference and the role of the Indian government in his death. But India's government has made its own allegations about Niger. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Niger was outspoken in his push for a separate Sikh state in India, and temple officials say he has received threats because of it, with his supporters alleging this was an assassination and foreign interference by the Indian government. But to the Indian government, Niger was a terrorist and wanted him extradited for what Punjab police called acts of reviving terrorism in the state, something he denied. There was also a cash reward on the books from India's counter-terrorism agency for any information leading to his arrest in connection with allegedly conspiring to kill a Hindu priest, charges he also denied.
And what do we know about the police investigation here?
Well, police and government officials have been tight-lipped, police releasing a description of 2 men they say were waiting outside the temple for an hour before gunning him down. But as for motive, they would not speculate, and the government also will not confirm whether there were known threats beforehand.
All right, Susanna De Silva in Surrey, BC, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A 9-year-old Winnipeg boy is recovering after being mauled by a coyote yesterday. Winnipeg police say the coyote chased the boy and his older sister when they ran from it. Another person reportedly intervened and chased the coyote away. The boy was taken to hospital with injuries and is in stable condition. Crowds have gathered in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, for the annual Hajj pilgrimage, which begins today. It's one of the world's largest religious gatherings and is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Muslims who are physically and financially able are expected to complete it once in their lifetime. In recent years, pandemic restrictions have led to decreased participation. This year, more than 2 million people are expected to take part. Poor air quality from wildfires has led to event cancellations in parts of Quebec and eastern Ontario. Environment Canada says the air quality in both Ottawa and Montreal reached a very high risk level, with people in affected areas advised to stay indoors and reduce their exposure. In Quebec, firefighters are battling about 80 active wildfires, but hot, dry conditions and poor visibility are making it difficult. Quebec's Public Security Ministry has been urging people not to set off fireworks or build bonfires during this St. Jean Baptiste holiday weekend. That's the sound of a children's choir in Seoul serenading veterans on an important day for South Korea. Today is 73 years since the start of the Korean War, and this year will mark 70 years since an armistice agreement was signed, ending the fighting. More than 26,000 Canadians were deployed in the war. 516 were killed. In Ottawa, a ceremony was held today honoring them all. The CBC's Kate McKenna was there.
More than a dozen Korean War veterans slowly march to the National War Memorial, where hundreds of people wait to honor them. Most are in their 90s. Their numbers are dwindling, and veteran Bill Black says Canadians have a duty to remember their sacrifice.
We need a legacy, and the legacy is the youth. We need more of the youth out.
The Ottawa air was heavy with smoke, but retired Sergeant Gene Bintz says he never once considered staying home.
It's the same as I never considered not going to Korea when they said you're going. As a military, you just do as you're told.
The Korean War started 73 years ago when 75,000 North Korean troops invaded the South. The United Nations had just been created, and soldiers from 16 nations, including Canada, were sent to fight. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Paul Dorsanen says Canada played a key role.
The Korean War was really a very important Canadian contribution to that conflict, to peace and stability, and to bring in rule of law and to defend rule of law and democratic principles.
The fighting ended in a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Tensions between North and South Korea still run high. But Korea's ambassador to Canada, Hoon Sun Lim, says Canada's contribution to the war was important.
Their contribution is not small at all. It's not insignificant. And Korean War is known as the forgotten war, but the memories of the Korean War are deeply held in the hearts and minds of every Korean.
Canada's Chief of Defence Staff Wayne Eyre drew parallels between the Korean War and what's happening in Ukraine. Both, he says, are battles to protect democracy.
It's important that we remember, because right now the world is facing similar challenges in terms of those who would like to expand, impose their view on the world, and so it's important to know our past.
Today's event in Ottawa is one of several planned commemorations of this anniversary. Events will be held across the country over the summer, from Quebec City to Banff, Alberta, and some veterans will even be traveling to Korea. Kate McKenna, CBC News, Ottawa.
Canada's largest city elects a new mayor tomorrow. Whichever candidate takes Toronto's top job will have to hit the ground running to solve the city's many current challenges, from housing to transit to public safety. Ithil Musa now on some of the top issues for voters.
More than 100 people are vying to become Toronto's new mayor, but there are only a handful of leading candidates, including former Deputy Mayor Anna Bailau and former Police Chief Mark Saunders. Polls suggest the frontrunner is former Toronto City Councillor and NDP MP Olivia Chow.
And we're going to keep building this unstoppable wave of hope and optimism.
The race to City Hall began just months after John Tory won a third term. He shocked the city in February by resigning after revealing an affair with a former staffer.
I've decided that I will step down as mayor so that I can take the time to reflect on my mistakes.
Now, Torontonians are choosing a new mayor to help guide Canada's most diverse city. Toronto Metropolitan University Professor Emeritus of Politics, Meyer Simiatiki.
I think Torontonians want change. I think they want a mayor who hears what their day-to-day challenges are and tackles those challenges.
And those challenges are big. Improving Toronto's transit system has been a major issue among voters for years. Another is the skyrocketing cost of housing and rent, says community activist Serena Purdy.
I'm looking for a candidate who is willing to face up to the real problems, who's willing to look at issues of property hoarding, of financialization, of gentrification, of really building compassionate systems so that we can get actually affordable housing, instead of kind of throwing money at developers.
The next mayor will also have to tackle growing anxiety over public safety.
We've been talking to a lot of Muslims on the ground. We've been visiting local mosques around the GTA.
Michelle Awan with Canadian Muslim Vote says safety is a major concern for people like herself, and she wants it to be a priority for Toronto's top politician too.
Can the future mayor create an environment that is safe for us? Can they create a protective city for us? And can they take action if there are events that take place against us?
But one expert says solving those issues will take more than just a change at City Hall. University of Toronto Professor Emeritus of Politics, Nelson Wiseman.
These problems require not just the city to look at them, but really the province and to some extent the federal government.
Experts say this mayoral by-election will have broader national implications because the problems Toronto's future mayor will have to confront are the same issues faced by cities across the country. Idil Musa, CBC News, Toronto.
While Toronto is in the middle of a mayoral election, it's also in the middle of a huge celebration. Pride Month. Crowds took to the streets today for Canada's largest Pride Parade. Under sunny skies, people were cheering and dancing, celebrating Canada's LGBTQ community. But it's a community that has faced a growing number of threats in recent months and witnessed attacks on its rights. As for Khan tells us, that climate has prompted Pride planners to step up security efforts.
For me, Pride is just a reminder that it's okay to be who you are.
This is Lana Violet's second time at Toronto Pride. The 25-year-old is also DJing at the event this year. Excited to be with friends and people from her community, she noticed somebody else too at the event this year.
I definitely noticed a higher police presence this year compared to last year.
And she is right. This year, the federal government released an emergency fund of $1.5 million for 65 Pride events across the country. The federal government said that there has been an increase in hate groups targeting safe spaces. Pride Toronto is spending $300,000 in insurance this year, up from $67,000 last year. Security costs and concerns both are increasing across the country.
And what happens when you start seeing a lot of online hate, you have to redirect how you're doing things. You have to redirect funding. You have to redirect energy and time and efforts to ensure that you're creating a space.
Julie Norbert-Demarche is the president of Fierté Canada, a national association of pride organizations across the country. The organization is responsible for distributing the federal grant. Even today, people faced heckling in parts of the Pride event. But nothing out of the ordinary, says Tom Hooper, a queer historian who opposes the federal grant.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I noticed as I was coming down here some protesters, sort of some anti-abortion protesters chanting back there. This happens every year, though.
Hooper is a critic of the federal grant. He says that organizations have been mishandling the money given to them.
Why I don't think the federal government should continue funding these organizations until we have true accountability and transparency as to what happens to this funding once it arrives in these organizations.
According to Hooper, such a bailout diverts money from the community. Demarche says that steps are being taken by Fierté Canada to have transparency around disbursing the funds. But the bailout is a step in the right direction to support the community.
These are huge events that take a lot of time, energy, and resources. But the outcome of that, like, look at the smiling faces, look at the people that are out just being who they are and not worried about criticism.
As hundreds of people come out today, a safe space is something everyone is looking for. How the money can be managed better is a conversation still taking place. Furkan Khan, CBC News, Toronto.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. In Berlin, some comedians are trying to prove laughter is the best medicine. A cheeky brand of dark humor from Eastern Europe is being thrown into the spotlight with jokes about some pretty bleak situations from the other side of the former Iron Curtain. It's becoming big with the city's English-speaking audience, so freelance reporter Alexa Dvorson went to a recent performance.
About 300,000 East Europeans now live in what was once the epicenter of the Cold War. And today, they can laugh about the fallout from the bad old days of Soviet occupation, thanks to a growing number of stand-up comedians like Dragos, a Romanian who's hosting the show.
Make some noise if you're Eastern European in therapy. Look at that. Young lady, where are you from?
Russia, says a woman in the audience, and so is her therapist.
That's a wise thing to do. You have to get a therapist from your own region of the world, okay? A therapist that understands your circumstances. My therapist is from Poland, and whenever I tell her stories about my childhood, she has flashbacks.
People of a certain age might get flashbacks on this converted cruise boat anchored in the River Spree, once part of the border between East and West Berlin. The swift current is a haunting reminder of the East Germans who drowned trying to swim across. Most of this audience is too young to remember those days, but one performer gives a chilling sense of déjà vu with his own story.
A year ago, I was a Russian comedian. Then I spoke publicly against the war, and now I'm more of a traveling comedian.
Dan doesn't use his last name on stage. He was targeted because of his opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's nothing funny about getting death threats, but now he can joke about fleeing Moscow with his wife. Their first stop was Istanbul, where they met other Russians, along with migrants from Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan.
We all came to Turkey for democracy, you know? We walk around Istanbul and we're like, okay, they only kill journalists here, okay.
Dan says he's following a long tradition of Russian emigres who've reinvented their lives abroad. At one point, he hired a lawyer to help him secure a visa so he could perform in the U.S. But when it came time to write the required letter stating his qualifications, his low self-esteem got in the way.
So here's what I did. I created a text file on my laptop, and I did mushrooms. And I met my true self. And I wrote a beautiful letter, and I sent it to my lawyer straight away. He called me in the morning, and he said, I don't think they will like this part about you being an invincible tiger.
Being invincible also comes in handy if you happen to be black and Bulgarian. Meet Dio Katunga.
I ran away from Bulgaria. I ran away so fast that even my accent couldn't keep up with me.
Born to a white Bulgarian mother and a Congolese dad, Dio has been turning his experience of everyday racism into comic material for the last 4 years.
I'm trying to hold down a coffee shop job, bro. Like, you know, how am I supposed to do this with an Eastern European accent? Can you imagine somebody asked me for directions? And I'm like, yes, you go left, you go right, it's right there. Fired. We don't trust this guy. That sound is not supposed to come out of that mouth.
The classic comic equation, tragedy plus time equals comedy, still holds. But the present moment demands a faster turnaround when old authoritarian threats make a comeback. Dragos is convinced a regular dose of laughter goes a long way.
I think, if you can make light of dark topics and this terror they're trying to put in your heart, you can basically disable it completely if you make fun of it, right? So you can't get intimidated if you're laughing. Because as long as you still have the capacity to laugh and turn all this despair into joy, then they can't really win.
Alexa Dvorson, CBC News, Berlin.
Sir Elton John walks out on stage at the Glastonbury Festival, decked out in a gold suit in front of a huge audience. The Rocket Man has said it's his final UK performance ever, and he kicked it off with his version of The Who's Pinball Wizard.
He's a pinball wizard, there has to be a twist. A pinball wizard got such a surprise.
A few days ago, Elton told the BBC he actually hasn't played many festivals, and never Glasgow.
I've never been asked to play before, so it's come at a time when it couldn't be a more perfect ending to playing in Britain than to play at Glastonbury.
He also said if he was a festival goer, he wouldn't be there for the headliners.
If I was in Glastonbury, I would probably be in one of the smaller tents, looking at one of the newer acts playing, because that's what I want to see.
Many Elton John fans did not feel the same, waiting by the stage for up to 15 hours to snag a front row seat to the history-making show, some of them dressed in their bedazzled best.
I was here at 7 a.m, I was third in the queue, and you can't miss Elton John. Last ever UK gig, Glastonbury, what a day.
So I figured this is such a once-in-a-lifetime chance that I can sleep any other day.
Safe to say, they were not disappointed.
Rocket Man, burning out his fuse out there alone.
After this, he'll head to Paris for the first of the final few dates of his farewell Yellow Brick Road tour, though many hope it's not really goodbye, and they'll be hanging on to the specific words John used on stage tonight. He said, "It might be my last ever show in Britain." So on that hopeful note, we'll leave you with a little more of Elton John on the world this weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.